How Banksy class? Okay, we've got another story. This one's called Betty and the Lamb's Tales. All the children liked nature lessons. It was fun to hear about the animals and the birds and the flowers. They liked hunting for things in the hedges and trees and the fields and the woods. Miss Wills, the teacher, had made a big nature chart which she put on the wall. There was a space left for every day. Now, she said, I want someone to fill in every space. How can we? Asked Jack. Well, said Miss Wills, any boy or girl who finds something new or strange or lovely in their walks can draw it or write it on a piece about it in the space for that day. And they must put their name in the space too, so that we shall know who gave us that nice piece of nature news. That's a fine idea, said Betty. It'll be so much fun to fill up all these spaces, Miss Wills. I hope I get my name there heaps of times. Well, you will have to use your eyes a little more than you do then, Betty, if you want your name on that chart, said Miss Wills. You're not very good at noticing things yet. Oh, well, I shall try, said Betty. I know one thing we can now look for. Before the leaves grow on the trees, said Joan, we can look for old birds' nests. We shan't be able to find them easily when the trees begin to leaf. And we can look for new flowers and listen to the birds beginning to sing their spring songs, said Pat. It was Pat who filled up the first space on the chart. He found a yellow coltsfoot, a very early one. He proudly drew it on the chart and then signed his name. Ellen filled the next space. She saw a lark fly up from the ground, high into the sky, and heard him even sing a song as loud and sweet. She found a picture and copied it, and then signed her name in the space for that day. A flower and a bird already, said Miss Wills. How merry our chart will look by the time it is finished. Harry found a butterfly sleeping in the loft. It was a very lovely yellow. It is a brimstone, said Miss Wills. Well done, Harry. You can make it a fine bright yellow on the chart. Sign your name, that's right. Betty hasn't put anything on the chart yet, said Pat. She said she was going to find heaps of things, but she never does. Where are your eyes, Betty? You never seem to see anything. Oh dear, said Betty. I really will look hard. So she did. And on the way to school that morning, as she went down the long lane, she did see something. She was looking in the hedges for an old nest, and she found a new one. It was a blackbird's nest, and the blackbird was still making it. It was almost finished, and the blackbird was putting a soft lining of grass onto the mud he had placed in the bottom of his nest. Do you remember I said about that curvature thing, like one of the toys you got for throwing things out for dogs as well? At my last school at St Martha's, where we had the 6 weeks holiday, and when we went back we had these little things that the kids played with, and in there was a bird's nest that had been made with mud and grass and sticks, and at the time I thought it was a blackbird's nest, and it could be a blackbird's nest because now actually we've got information about how a blackbird makes their nest. But obviously in the previous story we also know that a robin makes its nest that way as well. All this lovely information we're finding out from these very short stories of Enid Blyton. It's amazing. Anyway, Mrs. Fish done that thing again where she stopped and now she's lost her space, so bear with me. Right. Oh, he's actually making it, cried Betty, and she peeked at it to make it sure it really was a new one, a new nest being built. There it was, set firmly in the fork of a little tree. The tree grew higher than the hedge and was covered with long catkins that shook in the breeze. Catkins, they're those really beautiful, they sort of hang down and they look quite fuzzy and fluffy. I'll see if I can Google a picture and add it to Dojo. I shall have my name on the chart. I shall draw the nest, cried Betty, and she rushed off to school and told Miss Wills. I must go and see it if it really is a blackbird's nest, Miss Wills. If it's a new one, we mustn't disturb it. We mustn't disturb the bird too much, or it will fly away and not lay its eggs there. Miss Wills, Betty and Jack all went to see if the nest was really a blackbird's. And will you believe it? Betty couldn't find the nest. They hunted up the hedge and down the hedge, but they couldn't find it. It was well hidden, said Betty. Oh, Miss Wills, can't I count it? Can't I put it on the chart anyway? I'm afraid not. I must see it, said Miss Wills. Now we really must go back, Betty. It's late. Betty was really sad. They went to school, and on the way there Jack kept looking at Betty's dark hair. He wondered what the yellow powder was that was scattered all over it. And he suddenly knew. Of course, it's from the lamb's-tail catkins growing in the hedge. Betty must have leant over to look at the nest, and the hazel tree shook its pollen powder all over her. Now, if I can find a hazel tree with catkins in the lane, all I have to do is look for the lower branches and find the nest. On the way home, Jack looked for the hazel tree with catkins. There were 2 or 3 growing out of the hedge beside the lane. He looked carefully into the hedge below the trees for the nest, and he found the blackbird's nest under one of the trees. Above his head, the wind shook the lamb's tails, and yellow pollen powder blew all over Jack's head, just as it had blown over Betty's. That afternoon, Jack took Miss Wills to the nest. "How did you know where to find it all this time?" asked Miss Wills. And Jack told her. "The nut tree told me. The yellow pollen from the hazel tree's catkins was all over Betty's hair, so I knew she must have found the nest just below the hazel." "You're a clever boy," said Miss Wills. "I think you will have to count the nest as yours, but Betty can sign her name in the space too. A little share of it must be hers, and she must, as she found the nest." Betty was sad when she heard that she could not count the nest as her own. "I am silly not to have noticed where it was," she said. "I do think you are clever, Jack, to have seen the yellow stuff on my hair. I wonder why the hazel tree sends out such a lot of powder." She went to have a look at the hazel tree on the way home. "How peculiar that you should make such a lot of pollen powder in your long catkins," she said to the tree. The wind blew and the catkins shook and danced like long tails. Clouds of yellow powder flew out. "What a waste," said Betty. "I wonder why you make that yellow pollen powder. Is it to help you make nuts for us, I wonder?" The little girl began to look carefully at the bare brown hazel twigs. She saw some tiny buds growing on them, and then, much to her surprise, she saw that some of the buds had tiny red spikes hanging out of the middle of them. "That's strange," said Betty to herself. "That's very strange. Why do some of these little buds have red spikes? Are they kind of flower buds?" She picked 2 or 3 of the twigs with buds on. She took them to school with her and showed them to Miss Wills. "Look, Miss Wills," she said, "I went to have a peep at the blackbird's nest under the boughs of the hazel tree, and I noticed that some of the hazel buds have these funny red spikes hanging out. What are they?" "Dear me, Betty has begun to use her eyes well," said Miss Wills, pleased. "Betty, the hazel tree grows 2 kinds of flowers, the pollen flowers, which are the lamb's tails we love so much, and these funny little red spike flowers." "What are they for?" asked Betty. "They make the nuts, so we like to pick them in the autumn," said Miss Wills. "As soon as some of the yellow pollen powder flies to the red spikes, they can begin to make nuts. I am glad you saw them, Betty." "Can I draw the catkins and the red spike buds on the chart and sign my name there?" asked Betty. "Well, of course you can," said Miss Wills. It is one of the best things we shall have down for this month, Betty. Well done." Betty was very proud of herself. She drew the catkins on the chart, and she drew the catkins on the chart, and she drew and coloured some of the little buds that had red spikes. She drew a few that hadn't too. "They are leaf buds," said Miss Wills. "You have 3 things there, Betty, haven't you? The pollen catkins, the nut flowers, and the leaf buds. That's really good." "I shall watch the nut buds and see how the nuts grow," said Betty. "Isn't it funny, Miss Wills? The blackbird's nest made me see something else. It's fun to find something all by myself." Betty is watching the nut buds of the hazel tree now. Can you find catkins and red spike buds and watch the nuts growing too? So Betty was really observant in the end, without even realising that she was, and felt very proud of herself in the end. Now, these sort of things grow in the springtime. We're actually in our summertime, but these are definitely things we can look out for, and maybe we can make a chart in the springtime like Miss Wills did. This takes us to our next story, which is The Cross Little Tadpole.